striking.
I'm in my own
back. Do not move on me. You hear me?
Branson,
I don't want to hear it. Hands up
This
right
is my
now.
ID. Look at it. Look.
I said hands up.
Don't even want it.
Step back. Last warning.
Branson!
001. When authority meets accountability, the truth has a way of cutting through every excuse. Tonight, we dive deep into 3 separate encounters where ordinary citizens found themselves facing officers who had forgotten the most basic principles of their profession. These are not stories of violence or dramatic standoffs. They are something far more revealing. They are moments when the thin blue line encountered individuals who refused to be intimidated, who knew their rights, and who had the presence of mind to stand firm even when uniforms and badges tried to push them aside. What makes these encounters so compelling is not the confrontation itself. It is what happened afterward. In each case, higher-ranking officials stepped in. In each case, the truth came to light. And in each case, there were real consequences for officers who believed their authority placed them above the basic standards of professionalism and constitutional law. If you appreciate deep dives into stories that reveal the complex relationship between citizens and those sworn to protect them, consider subscribing to this channel. We break down real incidents with the detail and context they deserve. Now, let us begin with a quiet evening in a small California community that was about to become anything but peaceful. The sun had already set over Fairfield Valley, a modest suburb tucked into the rolling hills of Northern California. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other by name, where children played in front yards until the streetlights flickered on, and where the rhythm of daily life moved at a pace that felt almost old-fashioned compared to the sprawling cities just an hour away. On the evening of May 18th, Marcus Raymond was enjoying a rare moment of peace. The 41-year-old Army veteran had spent the better part of a decade serving his country, including 2 combat deployments that had left invisible scars he rarely discussed. Now he worked as a staff sergeant at a nearby military installation, training the next generation of soldiers while trying to build a normal life with his wife, Denise, and their 2 children. Their home on Willow Creek Drive was modest but well-maintained. A small American flag hung beside the front door, not as a political statement, but as a quiet acknowledgement of the years Marcus had given to his country. The lawn was neatly trimmed, the driveway recently sealed, and the garage door painted a shade of blue that Denise had spent 3 weekends choosing. Inside, the house was warm with the smell of dinner cooking. Their daughter, just 6 years old, was practicing her letters at the kitchen table, while their son, barely 4, built a precarious tower of blocks in the living room. Marcus sat in his recliner, the evening news murmuring in the background, savoring the simple pleasure of being home. None of them knew that 2 police officers from the Fairfield Valley Police Department were at that very moment turning onto their street, responding to a call that had nothing to do with them. The call had come in approximately 20 minutes earlier. A concerned parent had dialed emergency services to report that a toddler had accidentally ingested nail polish remover. The dispatcher had recorded the address, and officers had been dispatched to provide assistance and ensure the child received proper medical attention. But somewhere between the dispatch and the arrival, something went wrong. The address that should have sent officers to a home 3 blocks away instead directed them to the Raymond residence. It was a simple clerical error, the kind that happens in any bureaucracy, but what followed would be anything but simple. Officer Derek Branson was behind the wheel of the patrol car. At 34 years old, he had been with the department for just over 5 years, long enough to feel confident, but perhaps not long enough to have developed the wisdom that comes with true experience. He had a reputation among his colleagues as someone who could be difficult, someone who bristled at perceived challenges to his authority. His personnel file contained a few minor complaints, nothing that had resulted in serious discipline, but enough to suggest a pattern that perhaps deserved closer attention. Beside him sat Officer Rachel Harding, a younger officer who had been on the force for less than 3 years. She was known as a calmer presence, someone who preferred conversation to confrontation. But she was also still learning the delicate balance between supporting a partner and knowing when to intervene. The patrol car rolled slowly down Willow Creek Drive, the officers scanning house numbers in the fading light. When they spotted what they believed was the correct address, they pulled to the curb and stepped out. Marcus heard the car doors before he saw the officers. Living in a quiet neighborhood, any unusual sound drew attention. He glanced toward the window, saw the patrol car parked in front of his home, and felt a momentary spike of concern. Not fear exactly, but the automatic alertness that comes from years of military training. He stood and walked to the front door, opening it just as the two officers reached his front steps. In the porch light, he could see them clearly, a white male officer with a set jaw and an impatient expression, and a white female officer who stood slightly behind, her posture more relaxed. For a moment, everyone was still. Marcus looked at the officers looked at him, and the quiet evening seemed to hold its breath. Then Officer Branson spoke. His tone was not what one might expect from an officer responding to a medical call involving a child. There was no urgency, no concern. Instead, there was something that sounded almost like accusation. He asked if Marcus was the homeowner. Marcus confirmed that he was. He asked if anyone had called about a child. Marcus said no. Nobody in his household had made any such call. This should have been the moment when a professional officer recognized the possibility of an error. A simple comparison of addresses, a quick radio call to dispatch, would have resolved the confusion in seconds. Instead, Officer Branson pressed forward. He wanted to know if there were children in the home. Marcus confirmed there were. Branson then demanded to see them, to make sure they were safe. Now imagine yourself in Marcus Raymond's position. You are a decorated military veteran, a man who has served your country with distinction. You are standing on your own property, in front of your own home, and a police officer is demanding to inspect your children without explaining why. Marcus asked for clarification. He wanted to know what this was about, why officers were at his door. His questions were calm, reasonable, the kind any homeowner would ask. Officer Branson's response would set the tone for everything that followed. He said he did not need to explain anything. He said he was there on official business, and Marcus needed to cooperate. His voice rose slightly, carrying an edge of irritation that seemed completely disproportionate to the situation. Denise appeared in the doorway behind her husband, concern written across her face. She asked what was happening, why the police were at their home. What Officer Branson said next would later become a central point in the formal complaint Marcus filed with the department. He looked at Denise, then back at Marcus, and asked if she was his girlfriend or his baby mama. The words hung in the air like a slap. Let us pause here to consider the full weight of what had just occurred. A police officer responding to a call at the wrong address had just used deeply disrespectful language toward a woman standing in her own home. The phrase baby mama carries loaded connotations, often used dismissively to suggest a relationship that is somehow less legitimate, less respectable. To use it when speaking about a man's wife, in front of that wife, was not merely unprofessional. It was an insult designed to demean. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. He had faced enemy fire in combat zones. He had made life and death decisions under pressure, but he had rarely experienced such casual disrespect from someone who was supposed to represent law and order. He kept his voice level, though it took effort. He informed Officer Branson that the woman behind him was his wife, not that it was any of the officer's business. He asked again why they were there and what law enforcement purpose could possibly require such a question. Officer Branson was unmoved. In fact, he seemed to interpret Marcus's controlled response as resistance. His body language shifted, became more aggressive. He took a half step forward, closing the distance between them. He told Marcus to watch his tone. He said he was a police officer, and he would ask whatever questions he deemed necessary. When Marcus pointed out that he had rights as a homeowner and deserved basic respect, Branson's response crossed yet another line. He told Marcus to eat a crude and vulgar phrase that has no place in professional discourse, let alone in an interaction between a law enforcement officer and a citizen. Think about that for a moment. A police officer standing on private property, having arrived at the wrong address entirely, had just directed profanity at a military veteran in front of his wife. The complete absence of professionalism was staggering. Officer Harding, who had remained silent through this exchange, shifted uncomfortably. She could see the situation escalating, could feel the tension crackling between her partner and the homeowner. She stepped forward slightly, attempting to insert herself into the conversation. She apologized for the confusion and tried to explain that they had received a call about a child who had ingested something dangerous. They just needed to verify that everyone in the home was safe, and then they would be on their way. Her tone was different from Branson's, more professional, more human. Marcus looked at her, then back at Branson, and made a decision. He reached into his back pocket and withdrew his military identification. He held it up so both officers could see it clearly. He informed them that he was Staff Sergeant Marcus Raymond, United States Army. He had served his country for over 11 years. He had never had so much as a traffic ticket, and he would not stand on his own property and be disrespected by anyone, regardless of what uniform they wore. The revelation of his military status should have prompted a recalibration. Here was a man who had sworn the same oath to protect and serve that police officers swear, who had demonstrated his commitment to duty and discipline through years of service. A professional officer would have recognized a kindred spirit, would have adjusted their approach accordingly. Officer Branson did not. He dismissed the military ID with a wave of his hand. He said he did not care what rank Marcus held in the Army, that he was just a civilian now. He demanded again to see the children. It was at this moment that Denise stepped fully onto the porch. She had retrieved her phone and was now recording the encounter, a decision that would prove crucial in the weeks to come. She asked Officer Harding directly if they had the right address. She read out their house number and street name. Could the officer please verify that this matched the address in their system? Officer Harding paused. She pulled out her notepad, checked the information, and her expression shifted. Something was wrong. She stepped back toward the patrol car, reaching for the radio to confirm the details with dispatch. Meanwhile, Officer Branson continued his confrontation with Marcus. He seemed unaware or unconcerned that his partner was checking the address. He was too focused on what he perceived as defiance, too invested in establishing dominance in an encounter that had gone off the rails from the very beginning. The crackle of the radio broke through the tension. Officer Harding spoke briefly with dispatch, listened, and then walked back to the porch. Her face told the story before her words did. She informed her partner that they were at the wrong house. The actual address was on Willow Tree Lane, not Willow Creek Drive. This was not the residence they were looking for. Marcus felt a wave of vindication wash over him, but it was tempered by the residual anger at how he and his wife had been treated. He had been right. He had known it all along. And Officer Branson had been wrong. Not just about the address, but about every assumption he had made. One might expect an apology at this point. One might expect Officer Branson to recognize his error, to acknowledge the disrespect he had shown, and to make some effort to repair the damage. That is what a professional would do. That is what basic human decency would dictate. Instead, Officer Branson turned and walked back to the patrol car without a word. No apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Just a silent retreat that somehow managed to feel more insulting than all the words that had come before. Officer Harding lingered for a moment. She met Marcus's eyes and quietly apologized for the confusion. She seemed genuinely embarrassed by her partner's behavior, but she followed him to the car without saying anything more. As the patrol car pulled away, Marcus and Denise stood on their porch, processing what had just occurred. Their children had heard the raised voices and were upset. Their quiet evening had been shattered, and all because two officers had failed to verify an address before making accusations and demands. But the story was far from over. In the days that followed, Marcus Raymond did what his military training had taught him to do when faced with an injustice. He documented everything and went through proper channels. He filed a formal complaint with the Fairfield Valley Police Department, attaching the video his wife had recorded and providing a detailed written account of the encounter. The complaint made its way up the chain of command. Supervisors reviewed the footage. Internal Affairs opened an investigation, and what they found was damning. Officer Derek Branson had a history that painted a troubling picture. The minor complaints in his file, which had previously been dismissed as isolated incidents, now appeared as part of a pattern. There were previous accusations of disrespectful language, of unnecessary escalation, of failure to follow basic protocols. When viewed together, they suggested an officer who had never fully internalized the principles of community policing. The video evidence was irrefutable. Branson's language, his tone, his complete disregard for the Raymonds' dignity were all captured in clear audio and video. There was no way to explain it away, no way to characterize it as a misunderstanding. The department faced a choice. They could circle the wagons, as some departments do when officers face criticism. They could issue a mild reprimand and hope the story faded from public attention. or they could take meaningful action. To their credit, they chose the latter. On June 24th, approximately 5 weeks after the incident on Willow Creek Drive, the Fairfield Valley Police Department announced that Officer Derek Branson had been terminated from his position. The official statement cited failure to follow proper protocols, conduct unbecoming an officer, and violations of the department's policies regarding professional interactions with the public. It was a definitive outcome, the kind of accountability that citizens often demand but rarely see. An officer who had treated a veteran and his family with contempt had lost his job as a direct result of his actions. But was it enough? If you have ever witnessed or experienced a similar encounter, if you have ever felt the frustration of being treated with disrespect by someone in authority, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and share your perspective. Stories like this gain their power from the recognition that they are not isolated incidents, but part of a broader pattern that affects communities across the country. Marcus Raymond released a statement after Branson's termination was announced. He said that he had not sought to end anyone's career only to be treated with the respect that every citizen deserves. He hoped that this outcome would remind other officers that accountability was real, that a badge did not place anyone above basic standards of decency. Officer Harding remained with the department but was required to complete additional training focused on de-escalation and proper protocols. Her superiors noted that while she had attempted to calm the situation, she had also failed to intervene more forcefully when her partner crossed clear lines. It was a nuanced assessment, acknowledging both her better instincts and her failure to act on them fully. As for the family whose child had actually ingested the nail polish remover, officers eventually reached the correct address. The child received medical attention and made a full recovery. A simple ending to a call that should never have become complicated, but the reverberations of that evening on Willow Creek Drive continued to spread. The story was covered by local media, prompting discussions about police training and community relations. The department implemented new procedures for address verification, requiring officers to confirm their location before initiating contact with residents. Small changes, perhaps, but changes born from a failure that should never have happened. And somewhere in Fairfield Valley, Marcus Raymond returned to his routine. He went back to training soldiers, back to raising his children, back to building a life in a community that now knew his name. He had stood his ground, asserted his rights, and seen justice served. It was a victory, though, one shadowed by the reality that such encounters continue to occur in neighborhoods across America. The second encounter takes us to a different setting, a different set of circumstances, but a familiar theme of authority challenged by truth. Carter Springs was a small town in the southeastern United States, the kind of place where high school football was a religion and everybody knew everybody else's business. It sat in the middle of Franklin County, surrounded by farmland and connected to the wider world by a handful of two-lane highways. On the morning of January 22, 2021, 14-year-old Terrence Washington was doing what countless teenagers across America do when given a bit of freedom and a motorized vehicle. He was riding his dirt bike. The bike was a source of immense pride for Terrence. He had saved money from mowing lawns and doing odd jobs for nearly 2 years to buy it. His parents had matched his savings as a birthday gift, and together they had purchased the used Honda from a local seller. The transaction had been conducted properly, with a signed bill of sale that documented the exchange. Terrence loved that bike. He had spent hours learning to maintain it, changing the oil, adjusting the chain, keeping it clean. When he rode it through the trails behind his neighborhood or along the dirt roads at the edge of town, he felt a sense of freedom and capability that was intoxicating for a young person just beginning to understand his place in the world. On this particular morning, he had ridden out to a vacant lot near the intersection of Miller Road and Highway 34. It was a spot where local kids often gathered, a patch of undeveloped land that offered enough space to ride without bothering anyone. Terrence was alone, practicing basic jumps over a small dirt mound, enjoying the cool winter air and the rumble of the engine beneath him. He did not notice the police cruiser until it had already pulled onto the lot. Officers Brandon Mitchell and Sarah Kowalski of the Carter Springs Police Department had been on routine patrol when they spotted the young rider. Something about the bike caught Officer Mitchell's attention. He ran the plates through the system and received an alert that matched a report in the National Crime Information Center database. The vehicle was flagged as stolen. Now, Here is where the complexity begins. The bike had indeed been reported stolen, but not by anyone who had recently owned it. Years earlier, a previous owner had reported a theft that was never properly cleared from the system even after the bike was recovered and subsequently sold through legitimate channels. The seller who had sold it to Terrence had purchased it legally at an auction, but the database entry had never been updated. This kind of clerical failure happens more often than most people realize. The National Crime Information Center contains millions of records, and the responsibility for updating those records falls on individual agencies across the country. Sometimes items are recovered but never removed from the stolen list. Sometimes ownership changes hands multiple times before anyone discovers the discrepancy. For a 14-year-old on a dirt bike, none of this administrative complexity mattered. All that mattered was that two police officers were now walking toward him with purpose in their stride. Officer Mitchell approached first. He was a stocky man in his late 30s with a buzz cut and a manner that suggested he did not suffer fools gladly. He told Terrence to turn off the engine and step away from the bike. Terrence complied immediately. He had been raised to respect authority, and while he was confused about why police would approach him, he had no intention of making trouble. He dismounted and stood beside the bike, hands visible, waiting to learn what this was about. Officer Mitchell asked where he had gotten the dirt bike. Terrence explained that it was his, that he had bought it. Mitchell asked for proof. Terrence said the bill of sale was at home, that his father had it in a file with other important documents. This would have been an excellent moment for Officer Mitchell to exercise discretion. He had a cooperative juvenile in front of him, someone with a plausible explanation for possessing the vehicle. A quick phone call to the boy's parents could have resolved the situation in minutes. Instead, Mitchell made a different choice. He told Terrence to turn around and put his hands behind his back. He was being detained pending investigation of the stolen vehicle. Terrence's heart rate spiked. He had never been in trouble with the law, had never even been called to the principal's office. The cold metal of the handcuffs closing around his wrists was a shock that he would remember for the rest of his life. He tried to explain again. He insisted that the bike was his, that there must be some mistake. His voice trembled slightly, not from guilt, but from the overwhelming nature of what was happening. He was 14 years old, standing handcuffed in a dirt lot, and he did not understand why. Officer Kowalski stood nearby, observing but not intervening. She looked uncomfortable, shifting her weight from foot to foot, but she did not voice any objection to her partner's approach. The next few minutes felt like hours to Terrence. He stood in handcuffs while the officers ran additional checks, consulted with dispatch, and discussed the situation between themselves. Other cars passed on the nearby highway. A couple of other kids on bicycles rode by, staring at the scene before pedaling away quickly. Terrence felt exposed, humiliated, trapped. It was during this extended detention that an unexpected vehicle pulled onto the lot. Sheriff Thomas Garrett of Franklin County had been driving to a meeting when he noticed the police cruiser and the handcuffed youth. Something about the scene prompted him to stop. Maybe it was the age of the person in cuffs. Maybe it was instinct honed over more than 2 decades in law enforcement. Whatever the reason, he parked his vehicle and walked over to see what was happening. Sheriff Garrett was a tall man in his late 50s, with gray hair and a weathered face that suggested he had seen just about everything during his career. He had a reputation for fairness, for taking the time to understand situations before rushing to judgment. In Franklin County, his word carried significant weight. He approached the officers and asked what was going on. Officer Mitchell explained the situation. The dirt bike was flagged in the system. The juvenile claimed to own it, but had no proof with him. They were detaining him while they sorted things out. Sheriff Garrett looked at Terrence. He saw a scared kid, a young man who was clearly out of his depth, but not displaying any of the behaviors typically associated with criminal activity. Then he looked back at Officer Mitchell. His question was simple but pointed. He asked why a 14-year-old was in handcuffs. Mitchell began to explain about the stolen vehicle alert, but the sheriff cut him off. He knew about the alert. What he wanted to know was why physical restraint was necessary for a cooperative juvenile who was not accused of a violent offense. This is a crucial point that deserves emphasis. Law enforcement officers have discretion in how they handle situations. Handcuffing someone is not a neutral act. It is a significant escalation that communicates danger and criminality. To use restraints on a minor who is cooperating, who poses no threat, who is merely in possession of property with unclear provenance, reflects a choice about how to exercise authority. Sheriff Garrett understood this. He had made thousands of such choices during his career, and he had learned that restraint, in the sense of holding back, was often more important than restraint in the physical sense. He asked Terrence directly if he had any way to prove ownership. Terrence repeated that there was a bill of sale at his house, that his father could show them. The sheriff asked if anyone had called the boy's parents. The silence from Mitchell and Kowalski was answer enough. Here was a child standing in handcuffs, and the officers had not even attempted to contact his family. They had not tried the simplest, most obvious step to verify his story. They had jumped straight to detention. Sheriff Garrett pulled out his own phone. He asked Terrence for his father's number and made the call himself. 20 minutes later, Terrence's father arrived at the vacant lot. David Washington was a large man with kind eyes and a demeanor that suggested he worked with his hands for a living. When he saw his son in handcuffs, his expression cycled through confusion, anger, and grief in rapid succession, but he kept his composure. He understood that losing his temper would not help his son. He approached the sheriff, whom he recognized from community events, and asked what was happening. Sheriff Garrett explained the situation, the stolen vehicle alert, the detention, the need for proof of ownership. David nodded and reached into the folder he had brought from home. Inside was the bill of sale, dated 7 months earlier, documenting the purchase of the dirt bike with serial numbers that matched. The sheriff examined the document, compared the serial number to the one recorded in the system, and confirmed that they matched. This was the same bike, and here was clear evidence that it had been legally purchased. He turned to Officer Mitchell. He did not raise his voice, did not engage in theatrics, but his message was unmistakable. He explained that most ordinary people had no way of knowing if a vehicle they purchased legitimately had been improperly flagged in a database somewhere. That was not the public's responsibility. When someone produced a valid bill of sale, when there was no evidence of criminal knowledge or intent, there was no basis for continued detention, let alone for filing charges. He instructed them to remove the handcuffs. Officer Kowalski moved quickly to comply. As the cuffs came off, Terrence rubbed his wrists, struggling to process everything that had happened. His father placed a protective hand on his shoulder. The sheriff continued. He noted that even if there had been grounds for further investigation, the juvenile justice system did not work the way adult criminal justice did. A 14-year-old would not be hauled off to jail over a property dispute. There would be petitions, family court involvement, a fundamentally different process. Putting a child in handcuffs in a public place, in front of other kids, without first attempting basic verification, was not good policing. It was lazy policing. Officer Mitchell's face reddened, but he said nothing. There was nothing to say. A superior officer, the highest-ranking law enforcement official in the county, had just dressed him down in front of everyone. Sheriff Garrett's final words were directed at David Washington. He apologized for how the situation had been handled. He asked David to reach out to his office if there were any further problems with the database flag, so they could work on getting it properly cleared. Then he returned to his vehicle and drove away, leaving the officers, the father, and the son standing in the morning light. This incident could have ended there. A mistake was made, a correction was offered, and a young man went home with his father and his dirt bike. In many cases, that is where stories like this fade into obscurity. But David Washington was not prepared to let it fade. In the weeks following the incident, he consulted with civil rights attorneys. He gathered documentation, and he organized a press conference that drew media attention from across the region. Standing at a podium with Terrence beside him, David described what had happened that January morning. He talked about the fear in his son's eyes, the humiliation of being handcuffed in public, the failure of the officers to take basic steps before resorting to physical restraint. And he raised a question that many in the community had been thinking, but not saying aloud. He asked whether the same thing would have happened if Terrence had been white. It was a charged question, one that opened up broader discussions about racial bias in policing, about the assumptions officers make based on the appearance of the people they encounter, about the documented disparities in how black youth are treated by law enforcement compared to their white peers. David was careful to say that he could not know for certain what was in the officers' minds. He could not prove that race was a factor, but he knew the statistics. He knew that black teenagers were disproportionately likely to be stopped, detained, and arrested compared to white teenagers in similar circumstances. And he knew that his son, who had done nothing wrong, who had purchased his property legally, had been treated as a suspect from the moment police laid eyes on him. The press conference generated significant coverage. Local news stations ran the story. Regional papers picked it up. Social media amplified the message, with thousands of people sharing their own experiences and opinions. The Carter Springs Police Department faced mounting pressure. Community members attended city council meetings, demanding answers. Civil rights organizations called for an independent review of the department's practices. The incident had become a flashpoint for broader conversations about policing in America. In response, the department announced a series of reforms. Officers would receive additional training on juvenile interactions, emphasizing de-escalation and the importance of verification before escalation. The procedures for responding to flagged vehicle alerts would be updated to require supervisory approval before handcuffing minors in nonviolent situations. And the department committed to working with state officials to improve the accuracy of the National Crime Information Center database. Were these changes sufficient? Opinions varied. Some felt the reforms were meaningful steps toward better policing. Others argued that they did not go far enough, that individual officers needed to face personal consequences for their actions. Officer Mitchell received a formal reprimand but was not terminated. An outcome that satisfied neither those who wanted harsher accountability nor those who felt any discipline was unjustified. What everyone could agree on was that a 14-year-old boy had been put in handcuffs for owning a dirt bike. And whether the reforms proved meaningful or performative, that fact would remain in the memory of a community that had watched it happen. Terrence Washington still rides his dirt bike. He told a reporter months after the incident that he loves that bike too much to let what happened ruin it for him. But he also said that something changed for him that January morning. He learned that being innocent was not always enough, that doing everything right did not guarantee you would be treated right. It was a lesson no 14-year-old should have to learn, but one that too many young people in America absorb far too early. If this story resonates with you, if you have thoughts about how situations like this should be handled differently, the comment section is open. Every perspective helps build a fuller picture of the challenges we face and the solutions we might pursue. Our third and final encounter takes us into different territory altogether. This is not a story about a wrong address or a flagged vehicle. This is a story about constitutional rights, about the boundaries of police authority in public spaces, and about what happens when an officer encounters a citizen who knows the law better than they do. Buchanan County was a rural area in the heartland of America, a place where farms outnumbered businesses and where the county courthouse was the largest building in the town center. Built in 1923, the courthouse was an imposing structure of red brick and white columns, housing the offices of county government, the local courts, and various administrative departments. On a brisk afternoon in early March 2023, a man arrived at the courthouse carrying a video camera. His name was not important. He went by an online handle, as many in his community did, to protect his personal privacy while engaging in his activities. For the purposes of this narrative, we will call him what he called himself, a First Amendment auditor. The concept of First Amendment auditing had grown significantly in recent years. These individuals traveled to public spaces, government buildings, and police stations to test and document whether officials respected the constitutional right to film in public. Some critics viewed them as provocateurs seeking confrontation. Supporters saw them as essential watchdogs, exposing government overreach that would otherwise go unnoticed. Whatever one's opinion of the practice, the legal framework was relatively clear. In public spaces and the public areas of government buildings, individuals generally have the right to record video and audio. This right derives from the First Amendment, which protects not just speech, but the gathering of information that makes informed speech possible. Courts across the country had affirmed these principles in numerous decisions. The auditor had done his homework. He knew the relevant case law. He understood the distinction between public and restricted areas. And he knew that merely filming, without interfering with government operations, was constitutionally protected activity. When he entered the Buchanan County Courthouse that afternoon, he was prepared for what might happen. In his experience, some officials accepted his presence without comment. Others questioned him, but backed down when he explained his rights. And some, determined to assert control, pushed back harder. He would soon learn which category Buchanan County fell into. The courthouse was quiet in the mid-afternoon lull between the morning docket and the end of the business day. A few citizens walked through the halls, conducting whatever business brought them there. County employees moved between offices, carrying files and coffee cups. The atmosphere was mundane, bureaucratic, unremarkable. The auditor moved through the public corridors, camera in hand, filming the architecture, the signage, the ordinary operations of local government. He did not enter any offices without permission. He did not interfere with anyone's work. He simply documented what was visible in spaces open to the public. He had been filming for approximately 15 minutes when Sergeant Vincent Chesmore of the Buchanan County Sheriff's Office approached him. Chesmore was a career officer, having spent more than 20 years with the department. He had worked his way up from deputy to sergeant, earning the trust of his superiors and the respect of his subordinates. In many ways, he exemplified the local law enforcement culture, someone who saw himself as a guardian of order in a community that valued tradition and predictability. He was not accustomed to people filming inside the courthouse. In his experience, when someone walked around with a camera, they were either a journalist with a specific purpose or a troublemaker looking for confrontation. The man in front of him did not appear to be a credentialed journalist. Therefore, by Chesmore's logic, he must be the other thing. His opening words set the tone. He demanded to know what the auditor was doing and who he was. The auditor remained calm. He explained that he was filming in a public building, exercising his First Amendment rights. He was not required to identify himself, as he was not suspected of any crime. This response did not satisfy Sergeant Chesmore. In fact, it seemed to irritate him. He was accustomed to people complying when he made demands. The calm refusal felt like defiance, and defiance in his worldview needed to be addressed. He told the auditor to stop filming. He said this was a courthouse, not a public park. He needed to identify himself or leave the building immediately. The auditor did not stop filming. He replied that the public areas of a courthouse were indeed public. He cited the relevant case law, mentioning court decisions that had affirmed the right to record in government buildings. He noted that several federal courts had explicitly recognized First Amendment protections for this type of activity. Sergeant Chesmore was unimpressed by the legal citations. He was not a lawyer, and he did not believe that some out-of-towner could waltz into his courthouse and lecture him about the law. He repeated his demand, this time more forcefully. Stop the camera, show identification, or face the consequences. The auditor asked what consequences he was referring to. What law was he accused of breaking? What crime was being alleged? It was a simple question, but it cut to the heart of the matter. In order to detain someone, an officer needs reasonable suspicion that a crime has been committed or is being committed. In order to arrest someone, the officer needs probable cause. Merely being annoying, merely refusing to comply with demands that have no legal basis, is not a crime. Sergeant Chesmore struggled to articulate a specific violation. He mentioned trespassing, but the auditor pointed out that the building was open to the public during business hours. He mentioned disturbing the peace, but the auditor was speaking at a normal volume and had not disrupted any government function. He mentioned refusal to identify, but in their state, there was no stop and identify law requiring citizens to provide identification absent reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. Each attempted justification was met with a calm, informed response. The auditor had clearly done this before, had encountered these same arguments from officers across the country, and had developed answers to each one. Chesmore's frustration was mounting. He was not accustomed to being in a situation where his authority was so directly questioned. He had always operated with the assumption that when he gave an instruction, people followed it. The cognitive dissonance of encountering someone who simply refused, not aggressively but persistently, was deeply uncomfortable. He keyed his radio and called for backup. Within minutes, additional deputies arrived. The auditor now found himself facing 3 officers in a courthouse hallway, all of them looking at him with expressions ranging from hostility to confusion. The newly arrived deputies asked Chesmore what was happening. He explained that this individual was filming inside the courthouse, refusing to identify himself and refusing to leave when told. One of the deputies asked if filming was actually prohibited. Chesmore hesitated, then said he believed it required permission. The auditor interjected. He asked where that requirement was posted, what sign indicated that permission was needed, what statute or ordinance created such a requirement. There was no sign. There was no statute. There was, in fact, no legal basis for the demand. But the situation was escalating nonetheless. More officers meant more testosterone, more pressure to resolve the confrontation in a way that preserved the authority of law enforcement. The auditor could feel the tension increasing, could sense that he was approaching a point where the officers might decide to act regardless of the legal justification. It was at this critical moment that a door opened down the hallway. Captain Richard Mendez of the Buchanan County Sheriff's Office stepped out of the administrative wing, drawn by the commotion. He was a lean man in his 50s, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the slightly distracted look of someone who had been interrupted in the middle of paperwork. He took in the scene quickly, multiple deputies surrounding a civilian with a camera. Sergeant Chesmore's face flushed with frustration. Something was clearly wrong. He walked over and asked what was going on. Chesmore began to explain, but the captain raised a hand. He wanted to hear from the civilian first. The auditor explained concisely. He was exercising his constitutional right to film in the public areas of a government building. He had not entered any restricted areas. He had not disrupted any operations. He had been approached, demanded to identify himself, and told to leave, all without any articulation of what law he had violated. Captain Mendez listened. Then he turned to Sergeant Chesmore. His question was direct. He asked what crime the civilian was being accused of. Chesmore repeated his earlier justifications: trespassing, disturbing operations, refusing to identify. The captain considered each one. Trespassing. The building was open to the public. The man had as much right to be here as anyone else. Disturbing operations. He had observed no disruption, and none of the staff had complained. Refusing to identify. They were not in a stop and identify state, and absent reasonable suspicion of criminal activity, there was no legal requirement to provide identification. He turned back to the auditor. He explained that the public areas of the building were accessible to anyone during business hours. If he wanted to film in the hallways and public lobbies, that was his prerogative. The only restriction was that he could not enter offices without permission or record in areas clearly marked as restricted. The auditor nodded. He thanked the captain for the clarification. He had no intention of entering restricted areas. He only wanted to document the public spaces. Captain Mendez gave a curt nod. Then he addressed the deputies. He told them to return to their posts. This was resolved. Sergeant Chesmore stood frozen for a moment, processing what had just happened. He had been publicly overruled by his superior. The civilian he had been trying to remove was now free to continue exactly what he had been doing. Every assertion of authority he had made had been contradicted. There is a moment in encounters like this that often goes unexamined. It is the moment when an officer realizes they were wrong, when the confidence they projected is revealed as misplaced certainty. Some officers in that moment experience genuine reflection. They realize their training was incomplete, their assumptions incorrect, and they resolve to learn from the experience. Others do not. They experience the correction as humiliation, and humiliation breeds resentment. Instead of learning, they double down, finding ways to rationalize their actions and blame others for the outcome. We cannot know what passed through Sergeant Chesmore's mind as he walked away from that hallway. What we can observe is what happened next. The auditor continued his filming for another hour. He documented the courthouse without incident, interacting politely with staff members who asked what he was doing. He posted the footage online, where it was viewed by hundreds of thousands of people interested in police accountability and constitutional rights. The video generated discussion. Some viewers praised the captain for understanding the law and de-escalating the situation. Others criticized the sheriff's office for allowing Chesmore's initial confrontation to occur at all. Many noted that the encounter would have ended very differently if the auditor had been less knowledgeable or less committed to standing his ground. The comments section filled with stories from others who had been harassed for filming in public. People shared links to court decisions affirming First Amendment rights. Legal experts weighed in on the specific points raised during the encounter. The video became a teaching tool, illustrating both the challenges citizens face when exercising their rights and the importance of supervisors who understand the law. As for Sergeant Chesmore, no formal discipline was announced. He remained with the department, presumably continuing his duties. Whether the encounter prompted any personal reflection, whether he reviewed the relevant case law, and updated his understanding remains unknown. Some people change when confronted with their mistakes, some do not. What we can say is that on one afternoon in March 2023, a citizen's knowledge of constitutional law prevented an unlawful detention. A supervisor's intervention prevented a potentially worse outcome, and the entire episode was captured on video, preserved for anyone who wants to understand what accountability looks like in practice. These three encounters, separated by geography and circumstance, share a common thread. In each case, an officer or officers acted in ways that exceeded their authority or violated basic standards of professionalism. In each case, the citizens they encountered refused to be intimidated, and in each case, higher authorities intervened to correct the situation. This pattern is both encouraging and troubling. Encouraging because it demonstrates that accountability is possible, that supervisors can, and sometimes do, check the excesses of those they supervise. Troubling because it suggests that such intervention is necessary far more often than it should be. Consider Marcus Raymond, the Army veteran who wanted nothing more than a quiet evening with his family. He should never have had to show his military ID to be treated with respect. His wife should never have been subjected to demeaning language, and the officers at his door should have verified their location before making demands. Consider Terrence Washington, the teenager who saved his money, bought his bike, and wanted to enjoy a morning ride. He should never have been placed in handcuffs before anyone attempted to verify his story. His father should never have had to race to a vacant lot to prove his son was not a thief. Consider the auditor in Buchanan County, exercising rights that countless Americans have fought and died to preserve. He should not have needed a captain to intervene and explain the basics of constitutional law to a sergeant with over 2 decades of experience. Each of these situations resolved in a way that approximated justice. But justice should not depend on the intervention of supervisors who happen to arrive at the right moment. It should not require citizens to be military veterans or constitutional scholars. It should be the default, not the exception. The officers who failed in these encounters were not monsters. They were individuals operating within systems that often reward compliance and punish questioning. They had been trained in techniques and tactics, but perhaps not adequately in the humility required to admit error. They saw their authority as something to be defended rather than something held in trust on behalf of the community. This is the deeper lesson of these stories. Authority that cannot be questioned becomes tyranny. Power that is never checked becomes abuse. The badge and the uniform carry tremendous weight, and those who wear them must understand that this weight is a responsibility, not a privilege. For those officers who recognize this, who approach each encounter with professionalism and respect, who understand that they serve the community rather than rule it, these stories are not indictments. They are reminders of the standards that the best officers already embody. For those officers who see citizens as obstacles, who interpret questions as defiance and documentation as threat, these stories are warnings. The cameras are everywhere now. The public is watching. And accountability, though imperfect, is more possible than ever before. As viewers, as citizens, as members of communities across this nation, we have a role to play as well. We must know our rights, document encounters when necessary, and pursue accountability through proper channels. We must support officers who do their jobs with integrity while demanding consequences for those who abuse their power. We must engage with these issues not as passive observers, but as active participants in the ongoing project of building a more just society. What would you have done in these situations if an officer came to your door with false assumptions and disrespectful language? How would you respond? If your child was handcuffed for a bureaucratic error, what steps would you take? If you were filming in a public space and confronted by officials who did not know the law, would you stand your ground? These are not hypothetical questions. They are scenarios that could happen to anyone. The preparation we do now, the knowledge we gain, the conversations we have, All of this shapes how we will respond when the moment arrives. Thank you for spending this time with these stories. If you found value in this deep examination of police accountability, consider subscribing to the channel for more content like this. Share this video with others who might benefit from understanding their rights and the importance of civilian oversight. And most importantly, stay informed, stay engaged, and never stop believing that accountability is possible. The three individuals in these stories faced moments that tested their resolve. Marcus Raymond stood firm on his porch. Terrence Washington and his father demanded answers. The auditor in Buchanan County refused to be silenced. Each of them, in their own way, demonstrated that citizens need not accept mistreatment simply because it comes with a badge attached. Their stories are now part of the larger record, documented and preserved. And that record matters. It builds precedent. It shifts culture. It makes the next confrontation a little less likely and the next correction a little more possible. Change comes slowly in institutions built on tradition, but it does come. With every camera that rolls, every complaint that is filed, every supervisor who intervenes, the boundaries of acceptable behavior are redrawn. The officers who understand this will thrive in the changing landscape. Those who do not will find themselves, like Officer Derek Branson, facing consequences they never anticipated. The blue wall is not impenetrable. The silence can be broken. And the truth, as these stories demonstrate, has a way of emerging into the light. This has been a deep dive into three encounters where authority met accountability. Remember the names, even though we have changed them for this telling. Remember the lessons. And remember that the rights documented in our Constitution are not abstractions. They are real protections, meant to be exercised, defended, and passed down to future generations. Until next time, stay safe, stay informed, and never stop questioning. The moment we accept authority without scrutiny is the moment we begin to lose the freedoms that make us free.